Welcome to the Economics of Me podcast. This is the first episode of the Economics of Me podcast, your place for making sense of the economics of everyday life. Born out of my own learning, our mission is to simplify concepts, economics, and business, bringing it all back to first principles and what it means to you. And as we're telling stories, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wangal people of the Darug Nation, on which I'm recording this podcast. The Wangal people have been telling stories for over a millennia, and I'm committed to treading lightly on these lands as we move forward to a future of reconciliation. Why are we all feeling like things are slipping away from us? In a consumption economy, we buy things, and our shelter, food, and petrol also just keep getting more expensive. Are we in a Vibescession? Today, in our first episode, we explore the economics of self. Now, what does the economics of self mean? Well, in its simplest form, the economy is about people. We are the economy. We often hear words of the economy and it sounds like this big, foreboding, lofty idea that we are so far removed from. But in actuality, we are the economy. We play a part in the economy. To kind of frame it up, I think it's really easy to kind of talk about this idea of inputs and outputs, right? So on the input side of the economy, we essentially work. And in August 2024, of all people that were able to work and were of age, 96% of those people had some form of work. And only really 4% of those people were unemployed. And I guess this idea is that your role as a productive person in the economy is to work and to kind of trade your time and knowledge and to create some form of value in the shape of resources or products or a knowledge or a service that other people want to pay some money for. They want to buy something. And in turn, you get paid something, for that time and for that knowledge. And so this output side, to the previous point, really kind of comes in the shape of some form of value. This form of resources, it's a product, it's service, it's knowledge. And then there's this attached value to that. People and companies, and other countries are willing to pay something for that. And so this input and output equation means that each one of us is really a tiny nugget of a wider economic whole. This idea of really the economy, right? And typically how this is talked about is this idea of GDP. And GDP meaning gross domestic product. And so GDP is really essentially a measure of the total value of the goods and services that are produced within a market or economy. A total kind of like aggregated figure. So this big number. But this figure doesn't really talk about the individual at all. There's a kind of broken down figure called GDP per capita that's divided by people able to work. And we'll talk about this more in future episodes. But the main GDP figure is so far removed from your everyday. The Australian economy is not just purely about this GDP figure or this input-output equation either. In fact, maybe historically this narrative has really shaped our view of it, and maybe others' view of the Australian economy. Like for example, in Australia, we kind of mine things and we farm and we toil and we take raw materials out of the ground and then sell it to ourselves and to overseas markets. And this is really kind of an incredibly popular narrative that's rooted in this idea of like a pastoral or colonial identity of Australia. But in actuality, really over a third of our economy is in fact about consumption now. And so, I guess our economy being largely a consumption-based economy is really important here, right? Because when we discuss this idea of the economics of self, because really to be a bit part of this economy, we consume. And with this in mind, how does the consumption-based economy affect the economics of self? Well, in its simplest form, and we're talking about the median here, so basically as close to an average Aussie as it gets, we have to link it back to this idea of an input-output equation in our work. Again, we kind of all get paid some form of compensation for being a productive person in this economy. And then with this consumption, our wages, we use it to live our lives. By using it to pay for shelter in the form of your rent or your mortgage. We also buy food, and we have fun, and we use it to fund forms of travel and transport. And so the economics of self is really about our lives but also about how we feel when we trade this compensation and how we feel when we pay to purchase these units of fun and this mobility and I guess our food and our shelter. And to help me frame up how this translates to, both a high level. So when you think about high level, this idea of a macro number and a day-to-day level, which is a micro number, we need to ask ourselves the question of whether something like a GDP figure, does it really have a bearing on our everyday? A really excellent way to frame this up is this idea of a vibe session. It was coined by Kyla Scanlon, a teacher, content creator, podcaster, and it was actually popularized by her in the New York Times a few years ago. So what is a vibe session? A vibe session really refers to a period where you've got these economic indicators that might suggest stability or growth, but the kind of consumer sentiment and the overall vibes are low. And essentially, it highlights a disconnect between the traditional economic metrics and how people actually feel about the economy on a day-to-day basis. So is Australia in a vibe session in the moment? For us to understand this further, we need to look at sort of three big picture or macro data points. So seeing if this big picture macro data point actually lines up with what we're feeling every day. So we've got 3 points. We're going to talk about three things called CPI, the unemployment data, and this piece called real wage growth. So what is CPI? It's a term for the Consumer Price Index, but what does it actually mean? Essentially, CPI is a basket of goods like food, shelter, and fuel that you pay money for. And it kind of tells you on a broad level whether things are increasing in price or decreasing in price. Remember that CPI is a total basket of goods, and it's also known as this word inflation, which we've heard a lot about over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. And in Australia, there's two types of CPI that are commonly talked about. The first one being the General Consumer Price Index, CPI, again, includes all items in this sort of basket of goods, which is really the first one that I talked about. And then there's this thing called the trimmed mean CPI, which basically removes the impact of the most volatile items. Things like, certain fresh fruits and vegetables, things like fuel. So quite often fuel is impacted by things like war and other sort of economic shocks that can bring it up or down. And there's other things like short-term price fluctuations that are removed out of this. By including these volatile items, this trim mean CPI tries to provide a measure of really underlying inflation that's less affected by these sort of like up and down price shocks, I guess. And the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, kind of looks at this as like the core inflation figure. So the second macro figure that we want to talk about is wages, how much we earn. And the most recent wage price index, otherwise known as the WPI for Australia, sort of ending in August 24, was 3.7%. What does it mean? And what is the WPI? So the wage price index really kind of measures the change over time in the price of wages and salaries in the labour market. It reflects the rate at which wages are paid to us, employees, whether or not they increase or they decrease. And it tries to kind of like exclude effects of the changes of the composition of the labour market. So when things shift between industries or jobs, it tries to level that out. And so what it's trying to do is it's trying to really provide a clear picture of wage inflation in the economy. So broadly speaking, our wages have gone up by nearly 4% over the last year, right up to August. And I guess the last thing that I kind of want to talk about is unemployment data. And in the most recent read, it's saying it's at 4%, really kind of meaning that people that are of working age, only 4% do not have any work, and roughly about 96% of people are gainfully employed or have some form of work. So this has really risen from all-time lows at the start of 24 in January, when unemployment was at an all-time low at 3.7%. And so you have these three big macro or big picture indicators. They kind of point to a bit of a softening of the wider economy. It's certainly not dire, but that things things that we buy and the kind of costs that we see, or inflation, they continue to increase, albeit at a slower sort of rate from 8 to 10 months ago. Companies are kind of hiring less. The unemployment rate is creeping up. And so there's kind of less jobs out there. But if you compare it to kind of all long-term averages, it actually still remains very low. And then your wage is increasing. So it's increasing by about sort of 4%. But it's not enough to cover the challenges faced by things like price growth and also, things like unemployment. So then what does this mean for us and in our everyday and this idea of the economics of self? I want to bring it back to this idea of consumption, right? And the consumption economy, because how we feel and the vibes that we have when we consume is really important. And it's often called this idea of consumer sentiment. And so for in order for us to kind of understand this further, we really need to think about and talk to a few everyday items that we spend our compensation or our money on. There's really 3 things that we buy when we get paid. First, it's shelter, then it's your food, and then it's our transport. And when we talked about this trimmed mean CPI figure, the funny thing is it actually strips away transport and it strips away food from that. So it really doesn't talk about these 2 things. As we know, about sort of 8 million people in Australia rent. There's about 40% of households that have a mortgage. And with interest rates really being the highest they've been for over a decade, people that have houses with mortgages are really paying high repayments at the moment. And then there's the renters. So again, 8 million of us. We're really experiencing quite high rental price growth and record low rental supply. You probably would have heard of this idea of a rental crisis, which is playing out in Australia and in some parts of Australia. It's actually playing out in a lot of developed countries at the moment. And so I kind of want to jump into our everyday again. And I want to look at these sort of micro numbers. So the rental price growth for Australia in the last 12 months has been 6.7%. And in some areas, some sort of regions, it's really sitting around 10, 15, 20% rental price growth. And in the last 12 months, petrol prices, in Australia have increased by approximately 5.8%. Finally, when you go to the shops, when you go to your Coles and Woolies, your standard basket of groceries has increased by 9.6%. And so this kind of paints a really different picture, right? All of these percentages, basically your rent, your transport, your basket of goods when you go to Coles and Woolies, are really higher than the CPI number. And they're also higher than the wages growth number that we talked about, this WPI number. Your wages are growing. They're growing at 4%. But everything else is just outpacing what you can afford. And so you're kind of essentially going backwards. This is a challenge, right? The big numbers are saying something, but when you show up to your supermarket, when you pay your rent, and when you fill up your car, the challenges you see right in front of you, the economics of self is just not all positive vibes. So are we in a Vibescession? And so this leads us to why the economics of self is so important for us to understand. We've established that the economy is about people, right? And that this personalization of it in your everyday is really behind the idea of the economics of self. We're this kind of bit part of a bigger economy. We're part of this input and output equation that creates value that we also consume and then put money back into business and products. We buy products and services that move the economy ahead. We're part of this kind of consumption economy. And in this consumption lies the challenge, right? What are our vibes and how do we feel when we consume every day? Is there a kind of cumulative impact on our psyche when the majority of us feel like things are slipping further and further away? Core things like shelter, food, and transport. In the economics of self, we've established that how you feel when we consume is important. And so, how much more can these feelings diminish? Thank you so much for listening. This has been something that I've been thinking about doing for a while now. And it's really daunting when you put something out into the world, so I really appreciate your time. In the next few episodes, we'll continue to explore the economics that inform your everyday life. You can find the Economics of Me podcast anywhere you listen to your podcasts.